It started with a sound that shouldn't have been there. A whistle. Not the usual high-pitched howl of air tearing past the canopy of a fighter at full throttle, but something lower, almost like a flute note, vibrating through the metal frame. Sergeant Walter McLean heard it one gray morning in 1943 as he leaned out of the engine bay of a North American P-51 Mustang, idling on the tarmac at Inglewood Field. The pilot had throttled up to test the new intake cowling, and something in the airflow sang. The vibration ran through the fuselage like the string of a bow. McLean frowned. He'd worked on hundreds of engines since joining the Army Air Forces. But this sound was different, not dangerous, just unusual. The kind of noise that came from something working better than it should. When the pilot cut the throttle, the whistle faded into a hum. "Everything okay, Sergeant?" he asked. McLean hesitated, then grinned. "Yeah," he said, "but I think she's trying to tell us a secret." He didn't know it yet, but that faint whistle would lead to a discovery that would change the air war over Europe and make the Mustang the most feared and beloved fighter of the Second World War. The story of the Mustang had begun in frustration. In 1940, the British Purchasing Commission came to North American aviation with an urgent request: build a new fighter in record time. The company's president, James Dutch Kindleberger, promised a prototype in 120 days, a claim so audacious it bordered on reckless. What rolled out of the hangar that October looked sleek and fast, but beneath the skin, the P-51A was flawed. Its Allison engine gasped above 15,000 feet. Pilots praised its handling but cursed its ceiling. "A beautiful runner with a short breath," one test pilot called it. McLean, then a young mechanic from Kansas with grease permanently etched into his hands, had joined North American as a civilian technician before the U.S. entered the war. He wasn't an engineer, didn't have a degree, but he had something engineers sometimes forgot: instinct. He could hear when a machine was lying. When the early Mustangs came back from test flights overheating and stalling at altitude, the design team worked day and night on charts and airflow equations. McLean watched them argue over intake geometry, sketching ducts and cowls on chalkboards. He said little, just listened, always curious. One night, long after the engineers had gone home, he stayed behind in the hangar to tinker with a spare intake assembly. The whistle from earlier had stayed in his mind. He wondered, what if the sound wasn't a problem, but a clue? He shifted the curve of the intake lip by less than an inch, smoothing its angle with a file. Then, with the help of a night shift pilot, he bolted it onto a test aircraft and watched as the Mustang taxied down the runway under the moonlight. When the plane roared past, the whistle returned, louder this time, but steady. The pilot came back grinning. "She feels smoother," he said. "Climbs cleaner." McLean leaned against the wing and listened to the cooling engine tick. The numbers didn't prove anything yet, but he could feel it. He'd just stumbled onto something real. A few weeks later, when a British engineer named Ronald Harker visited North American to evaluate the Mustang, he noticed the same thing. The airflow through the radiator duct seemed unusually efficient. He asked who had adjusted it, and one of the crew pointed toward the quiet mechanic from Kansas. Harker studied the drawings and realized what McLean's accident had done. The redesigned intake wasn't just cooling the engine, it was generating thrust. The air compressed through the duct and accelerated out the rear like a miniature jet exhaust. The more power the Mustang used, the more the airflow helped it. It was a phenomenon few engineers had quantified yet: the Meredith Effect. named after the British scientist who had predicted it years before. McLean had discovered it by ear. That whistle had been the sound of air turning into speed. But even with the improved intake, the Mustang was still held back by its Allison engine. It performed beautifully below 15,000 feet, but wheezed where the European war was actually fought, in the thin, cold altitudes where B-17s battled Messerschmitts. When word reached Britain about the Mustang's range and stability, someone at Rolls-Royce had an idea that would change everything. Why not fit the airframe with their new Merlin 61 engine, the same power plant that made the Spitfire 9 a match for the FW190? The conversion seemed improbable at first, but the engineers pressed on. They cut, bolted, rewired, and prayed. When the prototype roared to life at Hucknall Aerodrome in October 1942, the result was almost terrifying. The Mustang leapt off the ground, climbed like a rocket, and kept climbing. It was 100 miles per hour faster than any version before it. The British called it a hybrid miracle. The Americans called it the P-51 Mustang. McLean just called it the first aircraft that felt alive. Back in California, McLean was promoted to crew chief for test trials. He watched pilots push the new Mustang beyond anything he'd seen. Dive tests that made the wings sing, roll rates so fast they blurred the sky into silver ribbons. When one test pilot pulled out of a 500-mile-an-hour dive without losing a rivet, McLean laughed out loud. "She'll outfly the devil himself," he said. Within a year, the Mustang had become the long-range escort bomber command had begged for. Its range stretched all the way to Berlin and back. Its speed outran every Luftwaffe interceptor. And its climb rate gave Allied pilots the one thing they'd lacked since the war began: initiative. For the first time, the bombers weren't alone. In early 1944, pilots flying Mustangs from the 8th Air Force began to notice something new. The German fighters were breaking off engagements. The once dominant Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulfs 190s couldn't outclimb, outdive, or outrun them. The Luftwaffe had lost its edge and didn't yet understand why. What they didn't know was that the Mustang wasn't simply faster, it was smarter. The combination of the Merlin engine, the refined radiator design, and McLean's airflow trick had made the aircraft efficient at every speed. Where most planes lost energy at high velocity, the Mustang gained it. When German pilots later examined wrecked Mustangs, they were baffled by the narrow, knife-edged air scoop beneath the fuselage. "They built a flaw," one said. "That duct should slow it down." He never knew it was the secret that made it unstoppable. By the spring of 1944, McLean had been drafted into the Army Air Forces full-time. He was sent to England to supervise repair depots for the P-51 squadrons. It was the first time he'd seen the machines he helped perfect come home wounded. On one cold March morning, he walked along a row of battle-scarred Mustangs lined up at a forward base in Suffolk. Some had bullet holes stitched along the fuselage, others had engines burned black. He touched the aluminum skin and thought about the men who had flown them. Farm boys like himself, young and fearless, chasing the enemy over Europe's clouds. A pilot stepped out of a freshly landed P-51, streaked with oil and cordite. "She got me home," the man said, patting the fuselage. "Ran smooth even with half her guts shot out." McLean smiled faintly. "She's built to forgive mistakes," he replied. The pilot didn't know how true that was. By the summer of 1944, the skies over Europe belonged to the Mustang. The Luftwaffe was bleeding itself dry, throwing wave after wave of fighters at the endless streams of American bombers escorted by these silver phantoms. From the ground, farmers in occupied France watched dogfights that looked like needlework stitched across the clouds. when the contrails twisted and broke apart, only the Mustangs seemed to return. From their bases in East Anglia, the P-51 squadrons ranged farther and farther, escorting bombers deep into Germany, to Munich, Hamburg, and finally, Berlin itself. The mission that had once been considered impossible had become routine. McLean, stationed at Leiston, watched from the tarmac as the flights took off every morning. He could tell which pilot was flying just by the way the engine sounded during takeoff. Some throttled up with gentle confidence. Others yanked the power lever like they were trying to break the throttle clean off. He always listened for the whistle, that thin, steady song of air moving through the duct he had once filed smooth by hand. To most, it was just background noise. To him, it was the sound of victory. The pilots who flew the Mustang called it the Cadillac of the sky. It was graceful, balanced, honest. In combat, it could dive past 500 miles an hour without shaking itself apart. It could roll faster than the Spitfire and climb nearly as well. But its greatest gift was endurance. With drop tanks slung beneath its wings, it could fly more than 1,600 miles, enough to follow the bombers all the way to the target and bring them home again. That endurance changed the war. Before the Mustang, bomber crews flew into Germany alone, slaughtered by swarms of interceptors. Now the hunters had guardians. One B-17 gunner wrote in his diary, "When I see those long-nosed P-51s sliding in beside us, I can breathe again." Over time, the German pilots began to dread a specific silhouette appearing behind them. A glint of sunlight off the Mustang's canopy, the narrow air scoop below the belly, and that faint whistle growing louder with each second. To them, it meant death approaching from behind a wall of sky. In the autumn of 1944, McLean received permission to visit a forward airstrip in France. The front-line squadrons were running constant sorties, and mechanics were short-handed. He arrived just as a group of Mustangs taxied in from a long-range mission. Their wings were streaked with oil and exhaust, their noses peppered with bugs and gunpowder. The pilots climbed out, tired and exhilarated. One of them, a captain with soot on his face, walked straight toward him. "You McLean?" "Yeah." The captain extended a gloved hand. "Then I owe you a drink. Your damned duct saved my life. Engine took a hit over Cologne, coolant leaking, temperature climbing. I thought she was done. But the airflow held her together all the way back." McLean just nodded. "She likes to bring her boys home," he said. That night, sitting in the mess tent, he listened to the pilots swap stories. How the Mustang could flip inside the turning circle of a Messerschmitt. How its guns stayed rock steady even in high-G dives. They talked about range, reliability, freedom, but not one of them mentioned the whistle. Only McLean noticed that part. Only he understood what it meant. By war's end, the numbers spoke louder than any story. The P-51 had destroyed over 4,950 enemy aircraft, more than any other Allied fighter in the European theater. It escorted bombers through every major campaign from D-Day to the fall of Berlin. The Luftwaffe, once untouchable, was ground out of existence beneath its wings. But to McLean, the real victory wasn't in the statistics. It was in the transformation. The Mustang had begun as a rushed prototype, an underperforming experiment. It ended as the weapon that broke the enemy's back. And somewhere inside that evolution, between the engineer's blueprints and a mechanic's intuition, a miracle of physics had taken flight. After the war, McLean returned to Kansas. He bought a small farm outside Wichita and traded turbine oil for tractor grease. But every spring, when the sky filled with the low hum of crop dusters and training planes from the nearby airfield, he still listened for that sound. the faint whistle of air sliding clean through a perfect curve of metal. Sometimes he swore he heard it. Years later, at an aviation conference, a Rolls-Royce engineer presented a lecture on the history of aircraft cooling systems. He described the Meredith Effect, the phenomenon where heat from the radiator was converted into thrust. When he mentioned how a field modification at North American Aviation had helped perfect the system in the P-51, someone in the audience asked who had made the adjustment. The engineer smiled. A mechanic, apparently. We never found his full report. But whoever he was, he understood the airplane better than most of us. McLean, sitting quietly in the back row, said nothing. He didn't need credit. The sound of that whistle was enough. In 1949, when the newly formed U.S. Air Force retired its last combat Mustangs, one aircraft, P-51D, Old Crow, was flown to a museum in Dayton, Ohio. During the ceremony, the crowd stood as the pilot throttled the engine one last time. The air filled with that same distinct tone, the thin, rising whistle that had once followed fleets of bombers over Europe. Some veterans in the crowd looked up instinctively, scanning the sky as if expecting to see formation after formation breaking through the clouds. The announcer called it the Song of the Mustang. But McLean knew better. It wasn't a song. It was a signature, a whisper of balance between man and machine, between instinct and intellect, between sound and flight. He smiled faintly, removed his cap, and whispered to himself, "Still singing, aren't you?" In time, the Mustang became a legend. Its image immortalized in museums, paintings, and stories told by aging pilots in dimly lit bars. Few remembered the nameless mechanic who had once stood on a wind-blown runway, listening to a whistle and deciding to trust it. But every time a restored P-51 takes to the air today, the sound remains. That same haunting tone beneath the roar. Born from a 1-inch curve filed by hand in a hangar on a quiet California morning, it is the sound of curiosity turned into speed, of accident turned into advantage, of a farm boy's ears turning science into victory.